So, welcome to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is about painting. So, we're moving on to another medium now. And the one thing that we should really keep in mind with the medium of painting is that it is a 2D medium. Of course, there will be methods used to show depth or dimension of space that are trickery of the eye, but it is a 2D, right, medium. What media do you see for painting? There's a lot of different options that you can use to create a painted product. The first one that we'll talk about is Encaustic. And I put a few images here showing you the different components of Encaustic paint. I also, for this chapter, you'll notice gave you a lot of different videos on how to make these various types of media, because I think that with making media, often a little show along with your tell is important. I think it's very important to be able to see the process of making these media. So please make sure you've watched your videos as you move along through all of the medium chapters. So you'll notice here what really is the basis of encaustic paint is wax mixed with pigment. That's really what it is made out of. And one of the pros to this media is that you create a type of permanence with your painted object. If you've ever spilled wax on something, you've knocked over a burning candle, and you've had to get the wax off of it, right? Once the wax is dried, that whatever surface the wax is spilled onto, I'm sure that you have experienced how frustrating that can be, how instructionally, how instructional that can be about wax sticking to something. So why use wax mixed with pigment? Well, it's going to create a permanence. It's going to bind with your base. Here you have a couple examples of Fayum portraits on the left, and then Byzantine icons on the right. And the reason I show you these examples is in both cases, you have paintings on wood. And the reason why they would choose encaustic is it would help to bind to the wood, right? It would help to stick right to the wood. That wax would help create a very permanent surface. So it's a very smart idea to use it. A more contemporary artist that we can look at using encaustic is Jasper Johns. And I just included a couple different paintings of his that he's famous for. He liked using encaustic because he felt it was unexpected. It was something that was considered sort of an older media, but again, had a lot of permanence to it right at the end of the day. So Jasper Johns is a good contemporary example. Another media you might look at in painting is fresco. And fresco is basically painting with wet plaster on wall. So where you see fresco used is in wall painting traditionally. And I just brought for you probably the most well-known fresco painting example, which is the Sistine Chapel, painted by Michelangelo under the orders of Pope Julius II. And I gave you all this information. We'll talk more about this when we get to your time periods discussions. But, it is important to understand that this was a project that Michelangelo wasn't all that particularly interested in doing, but the Pope sort of insisted upon it. But he used fresco here in both the ceiling and also the back panel, you'll notice, which is the Last Judgment that he painted during the Mannerist period under a different Pope. So what happens here is that you have pigments mixed with wet plaster and then applied to a wall surface. Now, what happens is you create a very permanent painting. If you go to museums and you see fresco paintings, typically they've been cut out from the wall and transported to the museum because, these become basically part of the architecture that they are housed within on some levels. And I always say with fresco painting, you better hope you're very good at it because it's wet plaster. It's going to dry. So you have to chart out what you could do in a day, because if you couldn't finish, right, you basically had to chisel off all that wet plaster again and start over. So it's a very laborious media. You have to be very disciplined. But the end product is really beautiful and really great. Obviously, as you see here, as I'm clicking through, right, various imagery, very famous imagery, right, from the Sistine Chapel project. So fresco painting. And of course, as I mentioned, also The Last Judgment is another fresco work from the Mannerist period, same building, different time. And some close-ups from that as well. Oh, and this one's fun, by the way, because people think that St. Bartholomew holding his flayed skin is actually a self-portrait of Michelangelo because he hated the project so much. So this is a funny aside there. A contemporary example is Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera was what we call a Mexican muralist. He was painting during the time of the early 20th century, 1920s primarily. And he is well known for coming and doing a lot of works in America for prominent business people. This is hilarious, by the way, because he was a card-carrying communist. And so that's just, again, another historical aside that he's working for people like Henry Ford. This is a piece done for the River Rouge plant, the Ford Motor Company plant in Detroit. For obviously a well-known capitalist, American capitalist, being done by a communist painter. So it's a little sort of a hilarious part of the story. Today it's in the Detroit Institute of Arts. So it's been, again, cut off the wall of the River Rouge plant before its demolition and moved to the museum. Same principles apply here, using the wet plaster painting technique to create this giant mural, right, in the space. Rivera is also well known for doing murals back in his home country of Mexico, such as the great city of Tenochtitlan that you see here about Aztec history. And these are some works from his work in the National Palace in Mexico City, celebrating, again, indigenous Mexican right history. So these are some great examples of fresco as well. You also can look at tempera paint. Tempera is made with egg yolk and pigment mixed together. It creates a very opaque paint, which means that light doesn't want to pass through it. The egg yolk creates this opaque quality to it, opacity. And it's, again, if you think about this, it's rather interesting because a lot of people want the shininess and luminous qualities from their paint, and tempera is like exactly the opposite. This is very common media in the time of the medieval period and the Renaissance period. A lot of works were done on wood panels, like you see here with the Bellini work. This is also another Bellini, a famous tempera painting of St. Francis.